hope I see USG.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a bunch of young people out here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint meeting on Russia's naval power in the 21st century. So pleased that I can see so many people here today. Normally, I like to think of July as being a quiet month at the Kennan Institute, but indeed we have 4 upcoming events over the next week and a half. So I'm just going to quickly run through all of them. The information is available on our website. But on July 21st, from 10 to 11 o'clock, we will have Maria Snegovaya, who is a columnist for Vedomosti, here, speaking on the intellectual roots of Putin's nationalism and ideology. On July 23rd, from 11 to 12:30, we will co-sponsor a program with our Kissinger Institute, focusing on the national idea in Russia and China. On July 24th, from 11 to 12:15, we will have Jared McBride, who is a short-term scholar here, and David Marples, who is the distinguished university professor at the University of Alberta, discussing Ukraine's decommunization laws, legislating the past. And finally, on July 27th, from 3:30 to 5, Cassandra Hartley, who is a short-term Title VIII scholar, will be leading a panel on the ADA and global disability rights, the view from Russia and Ukraine. So what is normally a very quiet month here at the Kennan Institute is indeed a very busy one. We're very pleased to co-sponsor today's event with RAND's Center for Russia and Eurasia. We hope that today's event is the first installment in a series of events looking at Russian military capabilities. And it's also part of a wider, broader security program at the Kennan Institute, where we intend to focus more on examining security issues across Eurasia. And leading that effort will be our own Michael Kaufman, and I'm going to turn the floor over to him to lead today's program. Michael, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Will. Once again, I want to thank everybody for turning out this morning. Very good use case. Was curious on July, Friday morning, how many people we could get turnout for a pretty specific subject matter debate. So, as Will said, we're doing this jointly with our brilliant colleagues from RAND. And I'll start off with the introduction. So, see a lot of familiar faces, but for those who don't know, Dmitry Gorenburg, Senior Research Scientist with CNA Corporation's Strategic Studies Division. His area of expertise includes security issues, military affairs, ethnic politics in Russia, Eurasia. He's published numerous articles on the topics, policy publications, et cetera, et cetera. He's also editor of the Journal on Problems of Post-Communism, Russian Politics and Law, and an associate at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies. Consider him a good friend. Oliker is director of the Center for Russia Eurasia and the senior international analyst at the RAND Corporation. Olia's recent research focused on international efforts to advance political, economic, and security sector developments in countries in transition. Her work naturally focuses on Russia, Central Asian Caucasus states. She has also looked at a number of these issues related in context in Iraq, Afghanistan, Liberia. Equally brilliantly well-written, published, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, I think the way we're going to do this is, Dmitry, I think we're going to look to you to give us a presentation, a backgrounder, Russian naval military developments and capabilities. And then we'll look to some points, comments, and questions from Olga, and that'll start off our debate.
Sounds good. Do I need to push something to turn this on?
Nope.
No? Okay.
Automate.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, thanks for having me. This is it's a great pleasure. I was a fellow here more than 10 years ago, and so it's nice to be back. So I'm going to talk about probably maybe 15, 20 minutes or so about the, oh, there we go. Now I can hear the mic. About the Russian Navy and what it's up to right now, what its plans are for the future. But the key thing that I think we all have to remember with the Russian Navy is that it's primarily still a Soviet legacy Navy at this point. There are despite almost 10 years now of shipbuilding, there's still fairly few new ships in service right now, and the ones that are in service that are post-Soviet are fairly small. There's essentially one frigate and 4 corvettes that have been built and commissioned and completed, as far as surface ships are concerned, post 2000, let's say, and a couple more pre 2000, but those were all kind of hulls that were started in the Soviet days, and they finally got around to finishing them sometime in the 90s. So it's still a Soviet legacy navy. The large ships that are still around are all legacy Soviet ships. There's the one aircraft carrier, it's about 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers in various states of operational capability, and including the new one, 5 frigates. So that's as far as the surface combatants. If we're talking about larger ships, that's what there is. Submarines are much better, and this has kind of always been an area of strength for the Russian Navy, and it was a capability that they spent a lot more effort trying to maintain, even during the bad old days of the 90s when they had no money. And so they've built, just in the last few years, there are 3 new SSBNs and 1 new nuclear attack submarine to go with, and then there's 9 older SSBNs that are left over, and a bunch of older SSNs. So the I'm going to talk a little bit later about the missions and that the Navy has. But just one thing that I think people in recent months, let's say, have been really sort of playing up the return of the Russian military. Right? It certainly is back to some extent, but as far as the Navy's concerned, it's still very much a work in progress as far as rebuilding those capabilities that they had in the Soviet days. As far as the overall role of the Navy in Russian military strategy, again, this may have to do with Russia's primarily a land power, and the Navy has traditionally been given a supporting role. And that's continued now, maybe even more so than, say, in the days of Admiral Gorshkov, when they really were trying to build up the Navy as a competitor to the U.S. Navy. So as far as missions, the key is strategic deterrence. It's been the primary mission for the Russian Navy since the Soviet period. And really, the Soviet Navy was built around protecting its SSBNs to guarantee the ability to launch a nuclear strike against the United States. And as I said, it was the only area that continued to receive financing in the 1990s. So that nuclear submarine missions remains the primary focus for shipbuilding, for what the Navy's planning to do, and that's really the main focus. The second mission at the moment is coastal defense. Now, traditionally, that just meant keeping foreign navies away from the Russian coast. Now, they're starting to do a little bit more work with, particularly the ground forces in joint operations. It's never a particular area of strength before, but it's a little bit more coordination now, having to do with some of the reconfigurations that were made over the last few years with the military modernization effort, where there were the unified strategic commands were created, so that rather than coordination between, say, the ground forces and the Navy all being carried out through Moscow, now it could be done at the regional level with the local commanders. And this is very much designed to mirror the American regional commands structure. So that's kind of what they were modeling off of for that. And we saw some of this in Crimea. There was some better coordination where the Navy was used to some of the amphibious ships were used to bring forces in to Crimea, initially secretly, and this and quite quickly. And if you can sort of think about comparing that aspect of the Crimea operation to the Georgia war, where the naval response was very much was fairly slow and not really coordinated with what the Army was doing, what the Air Force was doing. They just kind of, got all the ships they could together, put some naval infantry on them, and sailed them off. And they got to Poti pretty much after everything was, all the real fighting was done. So this now they're sort of integrated better with the overall response. So that's the second mission. Third mission is protection of sea lanes. Now that traditionally, there was a lot of making effort devoted to making sure that SSBNs could get out of their bases in the Murmansk area and in the Sea of Okhotsk. There's some additional important sea lanes coming on board. It's a slightly different definition of sea lanes, maybe, but protecting the northern sea route, for example, is something that the Russian military is thinking about, and they're building up some infrastructure in some fairly remote parts of their Arctic coastline and islands and so forth, to make sure that they can get forces there if they need to. It's not so much, from a rational point of view, I don't think they're worried so much about invasion from the north, but there is the need to make sure that they can kind of patrol the area and know what's going on, especially as there's more and more shipping, potentially going commercial shipping that's potentially going to go through that region. So, and then out of area deployments is. I'm kind of doing these in descending order. So they've restarted the Mediterranean Squadron a couple of years ago. So there's now a little bit more of an emphasis of on having ships in the Mediterranean on a fairly constant basis. And then the other areas are sort of familiar things that most navies do, going around to various countries to show the flag for political reasons. We see that from time to time. They go to Venezuela or Cuba, or and that usually gets a lot of attention in the U.S. press. But they do similar kinds of things in the Pacific region, various parts of the world. And part of that is political reasons. Part of that is kind of port visits to countries that might be potential customers for arms sales. So Vietnam, for example, is a country that buys Russian ships and submarines fairly regularly. So that's a place where they visit. They're trying to get more cooperation on arms sales with Indonesia. So that's another place that they've been trying to go to recently. And then finally, power projection. That's not something that's currently important as far as their vision of how the Navy operates, but it seems to me like it's something that they at least want to develop in the future. And when I get to talking about shipbuilding plans, I'll sort of justify that a little bit. As far as the Russian Navy is organized into 4 main fleets and the Caspian flotilla. And as far as what they're doing, when I've talked about this topic a couple of years ago, I was mostly talking about how the Pacific Fleet was rising. The Pacific Fleet was going to be the most important fleet because that's where there was the security situation in the Pacific was more uncertain. There was the U.S. pivot to Asia. There was rising China. There was still the potential for tension with Japan over the Kuril Islands. So the Pacific Fleet, I really thought was going to be the dominant Russian fleet for the next decade. Now that there's this crisis in relations with NATO, there's more. The Northern Fleet has kind of renewed its purpose in life, so to speak. So I think now there's more of a balance where both of the 2 major fleets are going to be developed in parallel. It's still, I think, the Pacific Fleet is going to be more important than it used to be, because it used to be really kind of a backwater, despite being a fairly large fleet. It was, got older ships. It got for even in the Soviet period. But I think now it's going to be more equal. And then there's the Black Sea Fleet. Now that they've dealt with their basing problem, so to speak, by taking over Crimea, they can renew the ships that are based there without any impediments, without any before they had to deal with the Ukrainian government and get their agreement and so forth. And the Black Sea Fleet is going to be the main once the ships there are renewed. It's going to be the main fleet for supporting the Mediterranean squadron. So it's nearby, and it's much easier to get ships there from there to the Med than having them come all the way from the Northern Fleet or the Baltic Fleet. Baltic Fleet still primarily focused on coastal defense plus training. It's conveniently located. It's also a good place to test out new ships because it's right near where most of the major shipyards are in St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. So that's the mission there. Caspian Flotilla has a lot of the standard missions of countering poaching, protecting offshore oil platforms in the northern Caspian. A little bit of potentially dealing with if something happens with Iran or something, but I don't think they're too concerned about a naval conflict with Iran in the Caspian. So that's kind of what the Navy is doing. As far as the future, let me talk a little bit about shipbuilding plans. So in keeping with that priority of the strategic deterrence mission, the SSBNs have been the top priority for shipbuilding. They started building them first, and they've completed building them first among all the different ship classes, as well as new attack submarines to protect them, the Yasen class. I'm hoping that you're all more or less familiar with the various travails of the Bulava missile. That there were various issues with testing failures and so forth. But it seems to be working well enough now to be for the SSBNs to be commissioned and to be operable. So I think they've kind of gotten over that hurdle. As far as the Yasen submarines, they're big. They're often compared to the Seawolf, U.S. Seawolf submarines, and in part because they're very expensive and very large, and so initially construction was very slow on them. It's gotten better, but the problem now is that the financing for military construction is all becoming more limited because of the economic problems, and so it seems they've now are delaying future subsequent construction of these attack submarines for 3 or 4 years down the line. So we're only going to see probably 2 or 3 completed before 2020. These attack submarines, and there's a lot of the conversation in the open press and in Russia now, in the military press, is about building smaller and cheaper attack submarines and cruise missile submarines eventually to replace the Oscar. So they're kind of following the same trajectory as the U.S. did with the Seawolf and then the Virginia class just many years later. But what they're talking about is having one class that's the smaller and cheaper class, but with 2 versions. One designed for protecting naval strike groups against attack submarines, and the other that would be armed with cruise missiles and that could strike both ships, carriers and so forth, but also targets on land. So again, kind of parallel to the U.S. kind of Tomahawk idea. The last thing on submarines, the non-nuclear submarines, they're now working on air-independent propulsion, which is something that they haven't had. The Germans kind of pioneered it. they say they've got a design, it's well in development, but there's no firm timelines on when it'll be ready. So, they're saying like probably 2017, but these things tend to, with Russian military construction, they tend to kind of slip, and often a lot. I remember when I first started talking about the Admiral Gorshkov frigate, it was supposed to be completed in 2009, and it's now scheduled to be commissioned in November of this year. So that's the first ship of that, the frigate class. So this just indicative of how timelines tend to slip in shipbuilding and the Russian military. It's not it's not a lot of it's not that different from a lot of U.S. military construction as well. I don't want to give the impression that Russia is uniquely ineffective in this, but nonetheless, it's something that there's a tendency, I think, a lot of cases to know all of the problems of our own military construction, but assume that everything that is put out there by public relations departments of the opposing militaries is going to happen exactly when they said it would for exactly the price, and that just isn't the case. So we need to make sure we're comparing like with like when we do that. So as far as surface ships, like I said, they started with small ships that could allow the Russian Navy to carry out that coastal defense mission. And I think by 2020 or so, they're going to have enough of those ships that they can really fully carry out that mission in terms of coastal defense. They're building corvettes fairly quickly. They'll probably have 12 or 14 of them by 2020 across the various fleets. And then the second step, so they start with the corvettes, and then they were going to ramp up and build frigates. And the Admiral Gorshkov I just mentioned, as I said, beset by fairly slow pace of construction. And now it's been made worse by an issue with gas turbines. So the gas turbines for Russian frigates were built in Ukraine. And when that defense cooperation relationship was severed, for obvious reasons, they suddenly didn't have engines for their ships. So as a result, only 2 of these frigates will be ready by 2020, and the others will depend on, they were supposed to have 5 or 6, and the others will depend on the start of production of gas turbines domestically, which they're working on. They've said 2017, 2018 again. It'll take 2 to 3 years to ramp up domestic production of gas turbines. We'll see. There's no good way to judge right now how quickly they can actually get that up and running, and how if they'll have problems or defects and that sort of thing. Now, because the Gorshkov frigate was being built so slowly, they decided to build the Admiral Grigorovich class, which was really just an updated version of the Krivak frigates that they were selling to India in the early 2000s. And they could build those, they knew they could build those fairly quickly because they had been, and they were supposed to have 6 of them for the Black Sea Fleet by 2020. But again, turbines, they only have turbines for 3 of them, and the other 3, again, are going to be delayed because there are no, they don't have a way to make the move. There's also been rumors that maybe instead of building, they have 2 hulls that are more or less going to be ready to go very soon, except for the turbines. And there's been talk that maybe they could just sell those to India, because then the Ukrainians would provide the turbines for them to go to India, and that would sort of allow them to not have these ships just sitting around waiting for turbines to come along, and then they could build new ones when the turbines were ready. So that's kind of what they have in terms of what they're actually building right now. And then there's sort of the design component of for the future. There's a design for large destroyers that would be like 14,000, 15,000 tons, nuclear propulsion, most likely. But there's just no way. There's the best case is, official statements are we'll have them the first in the fleet by 2023. I think there's absolutely no way that they could have it by 2023, 2025 maybe, just given how long it usually takes to build the first ship of any class for the Russian shipbuilding industry. Eventually, they want to have 12 or maybe even more of those, but now we're talking, 15, 20 years from now is when they'll have that class completed. In the meantime, they're modernizing some of the old Soviet cruisers. One, the Lazarev, which is a Kirov class, and three Slavas as kind of an interim step to keep their large ships, at least some large ships in the fleet while they're building these other ones. Now they're talking this talk of getting serious about power projection in the long term. So there's the conversation about Russian aircraft carriers has been going on for, I don't know, 50 years maybe. And the current plan is to have 4 aircraft carriers that are like 100,000-ton ships by 2050.
Slipping.
So the earliest they could start construction is probably 15 years from now. In order to get to the point where they can start building them, they have to modernize a shipyard, probably Sevmash, because the old aircraft carriers, the Soviet aircraft carriers were built in Ukraine. So modernize the shipyard, complete the design, develop an electromagnetic catapult, because they don't have a design for that, and they want an electromagnetic catapult like the Americans have, and build enough escort ships so that they could actually use an aircraft carrier in a way that makes sense. So those are all sort of interim steps just to get to the point where they can say, okay, now it makes sense to build these things. And the other part about power projection that is kind of interesting is amphibious ships. So in the past, Russian Navy just had amphibious ships that could support the ground forces and kind of do amphibious landings nearby. Now they're really talking about having helicopter carriers that could carry expeditionary forces long distances, kind of, they're talking about building a ship that's, 4 LHDs that are bigger than the Mistral, right? We didn't get the Mistral, but we got to have something even better. So, 20-some thousand tons, plus 10 or 15 of large landing ships in the sort of 14 to 16,000 ton range. I mean, they could build these. They're not complicated ships to build. There are a lot of hangar space and place to put troops and so forth. But it's still kind of a long-term proposition. So 2030 maybe they could have some of these ships. But these are all kind of in the last 2 months. This conversation has really gotten going in the Russian military press about having these kind of ships. And to me, just the fact that they're having this conversation about ships that are essentially, expeditionary ships means that there's somebody thinking about how we're going to use them, and it's not, to land troops in Odessa, because they don't need those kind of ships to land troops in Odessa. So one thing that's I saw recently that's kind of interesting is one Russian expert came up with a vision of the Navy for 2050. Now there's a secret shipbuilding program through 2050. It hasn't been released, so we don't know what's in it, but this doesn't prevent experts from sort of speculating on what might be in it. So the vision that this guy came up with, which seems like the kind of vision they could have, I think there's no chance of it actually coming to pass, is having permanent Atlantic and Pacific squadrons. So you have these 4 CVs. They assume an operational tempo of 50%. So 2 can be active, one always active in the Atlantic, 1 always active in the Pacific, and they just rotate them. And then each squadron would consist of an aircraft carrier, 4 destroyers, 2 frigates, 1 amphibious assault ship, 2 tank landing ships, and 2 nuclear attack submarines. So a real kind of battle group, 1 in the Atlantic, 1 in the Pacific. And that would really give Russia that naval power projection capability that it never really had before. And then in addition, you have the augmented Mediterranean squadron, various coastal defense forces. So that's, for each fleet, let's say he has another 6 frigates, another 6 corvettes, 6 non-nuclear submarines, 4 to 6 amphibious ships for coastal defense, and Yeah, so a real serious navy, really make Russia a real naval power. But the question is, and I think you can guess my answer is this achievable? And there's a couple of big problems. One is financing. So the cost of building such a navy is estimated at over 8 trillion rubles over 35 years. So that's about $5 billion a year, if you know, at current exchange rates anyway. So that would kind of require pre-2014 economic crisis levels of expenditures to be maintained on naval shipbuilding for the foreseeable future. Not at all clear to me that Russia can afford that, given the lack of economic growth that's going on in the oil prices and so forth. And we've already seen, even before the crisis, there's this constant friction between shipyards and the MOD over costs, where the MOD wants things on the cheap, and the shipyards say we can't afford, we won't turn a profit, we can't build them. And that's come close to derailing various projects. And this is all before crisis. So now, I think even less likely that the financing for this level of shipbuilding expenditure would come through. Second problem is industrial capacity. Most of the shipyards are not in the best of shape. The Sevmash is maybe an exception because of the importance of the submarines. But if you look at the shipyards that build surface combatants, Yantar has been very slow in building amphibious ships. It's a bit better at the frigates. Severny Verf, which builds the larger ships, is just slow. Everything they do just takes longer than anyone else, and they're sort of the shipyard that everyone is banking on. Then there's the Far Eastern shipyards. Until recently, they were almost completely moribund. There was this. There are several celebratory articles that Amur was about to complete its first ship in over 20 years. So that's kind of, I mean, yeah, I guess that's better than not completing the ship, but it shows, that it's a Corvette that they've been building for 10 years. And then we get to the other part of industrial capacity. The key components are purchased from abroad, and sanctions have disrupted some of these supply chains. So the gas turbines I already mentioned, that's the most visible. But there's also a lot of electronic components that are kind of not something that gets the headlines, but is important for actually making the ships work. A lot of precision machine tools that they depend on because they can't make their own precision machine tools as well as say, the Germans can. And if they can't import those because they're dual use, then that makes it more difficult to build some of the things they need to build. And it's really not clear how domestic substitutes, how quickly domestic substitutes will be developed. So just to conclude, in the near to medium term, it's pretty clear that the Russian Navy will continue to be what it has been in recent years, which is a deterrence and coastal defense force. So those two missions it can do. Power projection, I think, remains a pipe dream for at least 15 to 20 years and probably longer, as far as building these aircraft carriers and all this sort of thing. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that out-of-area deployment capability is likely to get worse before it gets better, in that sort of medium term. The Soviet-era big ships, which are kind of all they've got right now and all they're going to have until probably 2025, or if not longer, are getting older and therefore getting more prone to breakdowns, less reliable, and eventually some of them are going to have to be retired no matter how many modernizations and upgrades you do. And so that's going to reduce the capacity before they can start growing again sometime in the late 2020s with the new destroyers. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Olga.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dmitry. That was incredibly informative and substantive. Every time I hear really most Russian military production, but the Navy especially, the thought that pops into my head is that no one has ever explained to the Russian Navy that it is better to promise a 6 and deliver an 8 than promise a 10 and deliver that same 8. In Russia's case, they're actually delivering the 6, but it's this consistent, we're going to do the following things. We're going to deploy all of this stuff in the next year, and then the next year it doesn't happen, the year after that it doesn't happen, the year. Eventually it happens, right? We do have 3 Borets, though still, 2 of them were supposed to be accepted this year and still waiting. And it's this incredible, I mean, yes, absolutely, all militaries do this. It takes a really long time to build an airplane, it takes a really long time to build a ship. But wow, stop promising that it's going to be done tomorrow. Stop saying that you've got these grandiose plans that it will take a generation to carry out. Who knows what the security situation is going to be like in that generation. But I'm going to take a step back really quickly and think a little bit about where the Russian Navy fits into broader Russian strategy. And then just a couple of points, mostly highlighting things that Dmitry has already said, because he did give such a comprehensive presentation. But I think it's important to think about what Russia's trying to do these days, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about how Russia has no positive agenda, but that's not entirely true, right? Russia has a positive agenda. It's to make everyone look at it as a great power in the 19th century sense, but since when Russia looks around, it only sees two great powers in the 19th century sense, and those are the United States and China. It's really a cross between that and a superpower in the 20th century sense that Russia's going for here. So that's what Russia wants. Russia wants everyone to treat it with respect. Then you look at the military strategy, and the military strategy is all about threats and dangers to Russia. The world is a nasty place, trying to keep Russia from taking its rightful position as a great power. And you need to develop all sorts of capabilities to do that. Where does the Navy fit into all this? It doesn't fit well into all this. You know, what's interesting here is the Navy has been chronically underfunded. Even when everything else was chronically underfunded, the Navy was worse. You know, Dmitry talked about how the nuclear submarines at least got something. They didn't get much. What's fascinating is that what the strategic nuclear mission is central to the Navy, but from the standpoint of Russian nuclear strategy as a whole, they've never quite figured out what they're really going to do with their subs. They don't use them as a survivable leg the way the United States does, because they don't trust their captains enough to give them that independent decision-making authority. They trust their missiles, right? What Russia sees as a strategic deterrent isn't really the submarines, it's the ICBMs. So, you know, in the United States, when there's talk about giving up a leg of the triad, it's certainly not the subs. In Russia, the subs have been in danger a few times over the course of the last 2.5 decades. And I think that speaks to the Navy as a whole, right? That the Navy is this lesser stepchild of the system. And if Russia can't afford defense spending, and we're already seeing it, the Navy is the first place that it gets cut. That said, that doesn't mean it's incapable of doing anything. I have a slightly different take from Dmitry's on the Georgia conflict. I think a lot of it depends on what you expect. I saw, you know, that was the Black Sea Fleet guys, you know, the rusty, incompetent Black Sea Fleet. And they actually moved pretty much in their entirety to where they were supposed to go. Not real far, granted, but they got there. We have no idea what they could have done because the Georgian Navy folded. But, you know, they followed orders. They did what was necessary. You know, they weren't tested, but it wasn't because, you know, it wasn't for want of trying. They weren't tested because there was no one to test them against. And overall, you look at what the Russian Navy can do, and it's kind of the same direction as most of the rest of the force. Small wars, local wars. But if you're going to do that, you do need to think about combined arms. And that's something Russia has been moving towards since 2008. But there's some question as to whether it's going to keep going. I think that's going to be the important thing to watch, whether these reforms that we've seen since 2008 that have focused a lot on integrating the different services and their capabilities to work together, if those are going to continue, because we've already seen some reversals. I also think it's very much worth watching what happens with the Navy in the Arctic, the sea lanes of communication, because this, for now, Russia, as everywhere, talks a big talk about the Arctic, but really has been very cooperative, and for them it is mainly about economics and about resources. On the other hand, what we've seen over the last 1.5 years is that Russia is willing to chuck a lot of economic gain for some fairly counterproductive strategic goals. So if Russia does move to militarize the Arctic, the Navy is going to be part of that. I mean, it's something to watch. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, look, this isn't This isn't a powerful Navy that the United States or any other country needs to worry about in terms of a large-scale conflict. But few of us are really talking about a large-scale conflict with Russia, in part because Russia isn't up to a large-scale conflict with any of its forces. On the small scale, on the local wars that Russia has been fighting and, well, that we've been fighting, the Navy does have something to offer. And if it is, if it does spend money, continue to spend money on corvettes and the like, then there might be some capabilities that at least some other countries might be concerned about. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Olga. Many of you have questions, but before you get there, I actually, as the moderator, want to just sneak one or two in before I open up the floor. Kind of walking away from this, obviously, my impression is that ultimately the Russian Navy still looks a lot better underwater than it looks above water, right? That's the reality, and that's the way it used to be. Quick question, I think, for Dmitry is, we talked a lot about the overall shipbuilding program, but what about the coastal defense mission and the Coast Guard? As we see, the Russian Coast Guard is receiving quite a few ships, large cutters or corvettes, however you want to classify them. And the first ships to show up in Crimea to dock there were large helicopter-carrying Russian border patrol ships, as opposed to some kind of large flagship or anything more ostentatious. But do you know anything about to what extent Russia's really investing in going away from coastal defense in the sense of anti-access area denial to we're actually going to actively patrol all these parts of our coastline?
Yeah, well, so I haven't followed the Coast Guard shipbuilding program per se, but what I can say is that certainly, I mean, and this kind of goes with what Olga was saying about the Arctic, is that's really where the focus has been in the Arctic, is building up the Coast Guard capacity. For reasons that make a lot of sense, actually. I mean, quite rational, right? Build search and rescue bases, patrol bases, so that when some commercial ship runs aground somewhere, you can deal with it in even in fairly remote areas. And so for that, I think you do need patrol, at least some patrol capability, and not just ice-capable ships, right? This is not the kinds of ships that you can use to patrol in the Caspian or in the Black Sea or somewhere. You need a different class of ships, and they are building for the Coast Guard in the Arctic some ice-capable patrol ships. So that, at least that one area is one that I have looked at, and there's certainly a lot of activity there for a lot more ice-capable ships being built for the Coast Guard than being even talked about for the Navy. So from that point of view, that's really in the Arctic where the focus is. I would guess that similar kinds of expansion programs are going on in the other regions, but I just haven't followed it that closely.
Right, and it sounds from overall the way Dmitry described this is that, look, we don't have serious surface combatant capability to worry about. We don't have serious power projection to worry about, at least not in the near and medium term. A lot of it does seem like a pipe dream. So the question is, what in effect are we worrying about? Are we worrying about the coercive utility of this? Is that our allies who feel particularly vulnerable because they've managed to cut their navies much further down than even Russian naval capability? When we hold these sort of very large-scale naval exercises off of the Baltics, is this, our band playing to us? Is that what this is about, or is there a real purpose to, kind of showing this our naval capability, waving our flag?
So I think one thing that we have to sort of just remember is that the size of, given the nature, the sort of innovations in armaments, right? The size of the ship now has more effect on how far it can go, but you can have a fairly small missile ship essentially, right? That can, you put a lot of and they have fairly good, various kinds of cruise missiles and that sort of thing. And you can put those on a fairly small ship, and you can threaten Poland or the Baltic states or Ukraine or Georgia or any of those. So from that point of view, I don't think it's irrational to worry about those precise things, because and they can build I didn't talk about the the smaller ships, but they've been building these kind of Buyan missile ships and things. They're 1,000 tons, 2,000 tons, less than 2,000 tons, but with decent armaments, and that they're not going to go battle aircraft carriers in the Atlantic, but they're pretty good for threatening the Polish coastline. So from that, I think that's the legitimate worry. Now, as far as why we're doing these exercises, I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with particular concerns about the Russian Navy. It's more of a global, Russia's a threat now. They're signaling by doing these kind of exercises and these kind of activities, we're going to signal back by doing these other kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a lot of our activity is assurance activity rather than deterrence activity, right? We're reminding our allies that we've got your back. That doesn't necessarily mean that the capabilities that we have their back with have anything to do with the capabilities they're threatened by. It just means, we're here with you. Look, no. The odds of the United States and Russia going at it on the high seas are non-existent. That's not that's not what's going to happen.
Right.
The worst case scenario is actually much, much worse than that. We jump straight past that because in part the Russians can do that and they know they can't do it.
All right, thanks very much. Let me open up the floor. I'll probably try to take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, depending. So this gentleman over here, yes, you can come around. And Paul next, and Mark Galliotti. And then
I'm just going to have to call him out. Keep your hands up.
try to be quick if you can.
My name is Thomas Grindley. To what extent does Russia engage in joint exercises and cooperation with other countries which may have a bearing on its future military alliances?
Take some questions.
Yeah. Paul.
Paul Schwartz, CSIS. I'm curious about the state of advancement on anti-ship cruise missiles and air defense systems for the fleet. For example, how is progress proceeding in navalizing S-400, S-350 air defense systems, some of their latest and greatest, and are they moving ahead with making high supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles like the Yak Haunt? There are some reports that they might come out with a Mach 4.5 version. Or do you think that'll be a victim of the slowness in building ships, or do you think they'll move forward because of arms export market availability? Thanks.
Okay, specific question. And we had one with Mark over there in the center.
Thanks. Mark Galliotti. 2 very quick questions. Great presentation. So really, in reality, the purpose of the Russian Navy these days interdiction, denial, and political operations? And secondly, you talked a lot about the hardware. I was curious about the personnel. We know the problems that the Russians have had in terms of attracting volunteers, contract soldiers. Wanted to know particularly about the situation with the Navy and whether or not they feel they have the relevant technical skills that they can actually train their personnel with.
All right. So we had our first question about Russia's allies, partners.
Okay, so as far as so there was this they do exercises with other countries from time until 2014 they regularly did exercises with a lot of NATO countries, naval exercises with NATO countries. There was FRUCUS, there was BALTOPS, there was various Mediterranean activities. There was a lot of Black Sea activities. So they had all that. Most of that is gone now. There was a fairly highly publicized exercise with the Chinese Navy in the Mediterranean a few months ago, maybe even less than maybe a few weeks ago.
Back in June.
And that is supposedly there's going to be more of that in different places. They have a long-standing annual maybe biannual exercise with India, Indra. I think it's every 2 years. And that's going to continue. But I'm not sure that necessarily leads to alliances, much like exercises with NATO countries didn't lead to alliances with NATO countries when it all came down to it. There's, the relationship with, all of these relationships are much broader. The Navy is a fairly small component of, say, the Russia-China relationship or the Russia-India relationship. And there's a lot of, it's more of a signal or a symbol of what's going on in a larger relationship than a way to build it, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So the China, I mean, I don't think this is the place to talk about the Russia-China, the Russian pivot towards China, but it's there to some extent. It's a cause of concern for Russian leaders at the same time as it's seen as a necessity, because they don't want to be too, they don't want to fall into the role of China's junior partner. So there's certainly military cooperation with these other countries, but I don't think it's not at the level of alliances, and I don't think it's going to get there. And honestly, I don't think, other than Belarus, which is a landlocked state, Russia really doesn't have any allies. Armenia?
Oh, come on. Where else are the Armenians going to go?
But that's not an ally. That's a client.
Hey,
This is Belarus.
Well, no, Belarus has at least some of its own. Brings something to the table. It's. I mean, you can have the same discussion about some U.S. allies.
a lot of U.S. allies and what they bring to the table precisely would be a
the question about air defenses and anti-ship missiles, it's hard to track exactly what is happening until it's, there's certainly plans to do all those things. There's talk of, certainly the S-400, the naval S-400 is being developed somewhere. The talk of in the future we'll have the naval S-500 already. That's already there. So certainly, and they're by and large. I mean, the air defense is mostly an area of strength for Russian defense industry. Again, things get built later, and they've had problems with the long-range missile on the S-400, but it's something that they do pretty well, and it's something that they've done pretty well for their ships as well, and I think they're going to continue that. At what time frames, I don't know, but I think it's there. It's they're working on it. Mark's two questions. I think on the interdiction, denial, political operations. Yes, I think that's exactly what they're doing. I'm not sure there's much more to add to that for now. Again, pipe dreams of power projection notwithstanding. Personnel. I haven't seen a lot of information specifically on naval personnel. My sense is that they're better off in the Navy than they are elsewhere, but I don't have super high confidence in that assessment. They were among the first to start shifting to professional, and there's, I think, some of the reasons people might not want to serve in the military don't necessarily apply even now to the Navy. You're less likely to be secretly sent to the Donbass, for example. So I think that sort of thing is in place, and there's always the attraction, the universal attraction of navies around the world. You can go see the world, right? And so from that point of view, it's maybe now that they actually, in the last 10, 15 years, now that they have the funding to actually sail, that becomes more of a benefit.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I fundamentally agree with what Dmitry has said, and I would underline the caution against looking at countries exercising together as any sort of indicator of alignment. I would argue that military cooperation is done for usually one of three reasons. Interoperability, you think you might actually want to work together. Influence, and that you're trying to convince the other one to do something, or you're trying to convince other people to see you a certain way, which may or may not be true. And intelligence, which is that if you operate with somebody, you might figure out what it is they're thinking and doing. You know, the extent to which that actually reflects true alignment is pretty limited.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, after China, Russia also held joint exercise in the Mediterranean with Egypt, and it's not because of a forming Russian-Egyptian alliance, as they've landed so many transactional defense arms deals with Egypt in the past several years. That's a growing transactional relationship, and those exercises are a follow-on to that, not the cause of all the deals. All right, I'll open up the floor again for a couple more quick questions. We have a gentleman right there. Ask him if you can get to him on the far left. Hold up.
Sufyan Zhemukhov, George Washington University. During 2008 presidential debates, Mitt Romney criticized Obama that during his tenure, the number of ships in the U.S. Navy decreased. And President Obama replied that today it's not about the number of ships, but quality. And there is this new strategy that is different from the old days concept of navies. And you mentioned that from Russian side, Russian fleet is built on the Soviet legacy concepts. Is there critical generational difference between the American or Western concepts of Navy, the meaning of Navy, and the Russian one? Thanks.
Okay, good question. One from that gentleman in the middle there. Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm Paul Olhovsky, and I'm with the Department of Navy, but I speak as an individual,
Of course.
not for the government. Talk a little bit of what the gentleman said over here. Your paradigms seem to be a little old, and let me just challenge the idea that, for example, requirements. The Russian Navy, for example, they're very seriously considering of putting a lot of diesels, the Kilo class, into the Black Sea because they're land attack cruise missile platforms that can reach all of continental Europe and a good part of the Middle East at 1,500 nautical miles with their new SSN-30, which they've tested and shown that it works. So again, it's not the number of units anymore, it's what do those units have on them and what can they reach? What are their range rings? Start drawing those around and the picture becomes a little different. I'm very guilty of this and a victim of looking at current circumstances to try to predict future situations. We're very bad at predicting the price of oil. We never thought it would drop as far as it has now. We didn't know it would go over $100 a barrel before. So where this is going isn't quite clear. The same thing with sanctions and where Russia would get its military technology. I would suggest that in 3 or 5 years, things may have settled down, international accommodations may have been met, whether things could be again manufactured in Ukraine or purchased elsewhere, or France could reconsider. I mean, is that conceivable that the French could change their mind in terms of sales? Yes, of course the situation is very tense right now. Is that necessarily a predictor? And finally, yes, we are looking at the Russian Navy as a kind of a ghost in terms of numbers and maybe even capability of its former self, but they are going to put half of their nuclear deterrent on their strategic subs. Would you do that if you didn't have a lot of confidence in them as undersea platforms? And my last comment is, that's exactly what we do with our SSBNs. They're not there just to be submarines, they're there to shoot missiles. That's what they're for, to fire the missiles. The SLBMs. Okay. So that's it for my points. Too many points.
And lastly, gentleman in the green shirt in the back there. I see.
Thank you. Derek Rendy, Defense Threat Reduction Agency. To kind of to kind of go on what this gentleman here said regarding submarines. Given the fact that the Kasaka 1 has completed sea trials, fully loaded with the Bulava missile, Kasaka 2 is just behind it, and Kasaka 3 is kind of in the process as well. And the amount of upgrades that they're making in the Northern Fleet, as far as infrastructure, piers, and security and stuff like that to the Northern Fleet, do you foresee in the future them making them same amount of upgrades and infrastructure upgrades to Ribachi and possibly moving any of the Kasaka submarines and the Bulava missile out that way?
You mean that's the Bores? What is Kasaka? I haven't heard this.
Kasaka 1, 2, 3.
Kasaka 1, Kasaka 2,
okay.
Kasaka 3, yes.
Okay.
Okay, I haven't heard that term before.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
All right. So some of these Dmitry, you could probably group together because there's a lot here that basically, as
Yeah.
my sense was, about the capabilities on the ships. And
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the Bores are, with the exception of the first one, are going to the Pacific. Not the Yuri Del Garuki, but then the other two, and they're and they're because the point is that they need to replace the Delta threes. So those are the priority is, and they are talking about upgrading Viluchinsk for sure. I mean, there was even talk of a floating nuclear reactor ship being put there to power the region as well as the submarine. So I think that's certainly the plan. I'm kind of going through these backwards, I guess, but I think Paul and I are. I think we're actually largely in agreement. I mean, you mentioned the kilos. I said the same thing about just the surface ships, the smaller missile ships that can launch cruise missiles, even if they just can't go very far, right? But they can still. The ships can't go. The ships are not long. They're not going to go out in the blue water kind of thing. Yeah, right. Well. They would if they wanted to threaten the U.S., right? They don't if they want to threaten Europe. Yeah. So that's the point. And I think that this maybe applies to Sufyan's question as well. Is that they are also moving towards this fewer platforms, more capabilities per platform model, and that's natural. The ship is expensive, and it's easier to put a bunch of armaments on. And they're also talking about, and in some cases doing, these kind of modular construction designs where you can swap out containers essentially with different kinds of armaments depending on the mission, and sort of become, and your corvette or your frigate or whatever becomes a multi-mission ship just because you can bring it into port and swap out your cruise missiles for whatever else you might need for, whether it's anti-ship or land targeting, and you use different missiles. And so that's in place, and that's going to make the Navy more effective for these kind of combined arms operations. But it doesn't help in terms of the power projection mission, in the sense of we're going to go fight the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic somewhere. And then if you think of it that way, but I think we're largely in agreement on what it can and can't do. In terms of, I agree with you that price of oil is unpredictable, sanctions can come and go, but I think the larger problem for them is that even when the price of oil was $150 a barrel, when there were no sanctions, they were still, taking a long time to build. The shipbuilding industry was not in the best of shape, and now we can think about, maybe they can improve it rapidly, but given what we know about how the Russian economy, state-directed economy has been operating in recent years, I don't have a lot of faith in their ability to make their shipyards more efficient, even if all those other things became more favorable. All those other conditions became more favorable for them.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think the 90s and early aughts did a lot of damage to Russian naval shipbuilding capability, and I think the last couple of years and the next year are going to do more, right? So even if the sanctions are reversed, even if the French do sell them the Mistrals, well, all of which actually would then imply that we're not that worried about them. But leaving that aside, that we somehow are still that worried about them, or we think it's all going to keep reversing, it's going to take them a really long time and some massive cultural changes and some massive infrastructure to get out of that. We're already talking about programs that take decades. So, and we're postponing them. So, you know, it's like turning a carrier battle group around, right? It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of space. So, you know, it is going to have an impact. That's something, you know, even I, who am very, very hesitant to predict the future, am comfortable predicting. Really quickly on the SLBMs. You know, it's interesting because I would argue that a big part of the reason that Russia has strategic submarines is because the United States does. It's a mirroring thing that you want a similar system, but every time they write and talk about it and look at the way that they funded stuff and still fund these things, it is the strategic rocket forces that are privileged. Yet, you're absolutely right, the submarines eat warhead numbers, and if you're in an arms control regime, they eat a lot of warhead numbers, and particularly when the Russians start talking about putting a lot of MIRVed capabilities on their ICBMs, you start doing this math, and that also makes you wonder exactly what they're really going to do with the submarine fleet, particularly given that it is so slow to build. You know, that's one to keep watching.
Okay, thank you. No, really, really good answers. Almost kind of coming out, I was thinking that, you know, maybe power projection, not relevant, but the capabilities you can get on a lot of old platforms on the ship definitely get you the coercion you need. And you can power project to your neighbors pretty easily without a high price, even if you can't build the ships, you know. You can certainly get to the countries that matter around you. All right, let's take a kind of next batch of questions. Hold on a second. Jorge Benitez here.
Hi, George Benitez with the Atlantic Council. I have two questions. The first one is, which of the Russian fleets have had the most exercises in the past year? And my second question is about Kaliningrad. How is the Russian Navy adapting to its new geostrategic role in Europe? It's Russia's border with NATO now. It's the most exposed part of Russian territory. And at the same time, it also plays a significant effect in contesting NATO airspace and sea lines of communication. Thank you.
Thanks, George. All right, next question down there in the middle.
Hi, Jeff Edmonds, Director for Russia on the National Security Council staff. We have seen an increase in out-of-area deployments over the years, and I was wondering if you've seen any evidence of maintenance issues and if you think that will impact future deployments.
Okay, maintenance question, and let's take one more. Anybody? I actually right next to you again. There you go.
Boris Linsky, I'm retired. How about the force projection of the Russian Navy, that is, support bases that they may need in the Mediterranean, for example, or even in the South Atlantic or Latin America? What is the status of that? Thank you.
Okay, good questions. And Dmitry, I should sort of add, since we're kind of on the logistics support bases and all this trend, you know, if you want to have this dream unicorn Navy in 2050, it's going to have carrier groups and you go out and do things, you're going to have to think about the logistics now too. So what's the planning?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you look at Soviet/Russian naval presence in the Med over the decades, which I did once, you find that it's cyclical and it correlates pretty much exactly with port access, going back to the 50s, right? So there's a lot of presence in the late 50s through 1961 when they had a base in Albania. They get kicked out of Albania in 1961. They're almost absent from the Med for the next couple of years, and then they start sort of looking around and eventually get Egypt, which sort of leads to the peak in the early 70s, and they get kicked out of Egypt, and it becomes more difficult for them to operate. You know, they still have, you know, there's Syria, there's a few other places, but it's sort of, so where they're at now is they're in this phase, which is also very characteristic of old Soviet tactics, which is to go around and visit different ports and talk to different governments and see where, you know, which ones might be amenable to allowing access. So we're seeing this in Cyprus, to some extent in Greece. Egypt was a candidate. It's kind of faded away with Egypt, I think, over the last year or so. It's you know, I think they're maybe got a message that they weren't as welcome as they might want to be. But Cyprus is certainly a place where there have been some agreements on what they're looking right now for is not a base, but access. So if they have a problem, this kind of leads to the maintenance issues, right? They want to have a place where they can put in, do repairs, and then, you know, even separate from problems, maybe come in, do some R&R, you know, that sort of thing that like all navies want to do. So that's the Med is, I think, the main focus for this right now because of the Med Squadron. Other areas, I mean, you know, there's been occasional talk with Vietnam about Cam Ranh Bay, but it doesn't really ever seem very serious to me. I don't know. I mean, maybe they'll renew a lease at some point or something, but I'm not sure that I see those signals. And then, you know, farther out, the Caribbean, they don't have the reach, right? I mean, they're perfectly happy to send a couple ships every year or two to visit Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then go home. And I think that's about all they need right now. And as long as some combination of the leaders of those three countries are willing to host them when they come, that's really sufficient. In terms of, more specifically on the maintenance piece, you know, whenever Russian ships go far away, they bring a tugboat. And that says something about their confidence about, you know, and some ships are better than others. Some ships are known to be, you know, the Kuznetsov, I don't think ever goes anywhere without breaking down, at least once. And if you, I'm not sure any of the Soviet many destroyers still go anywhere, but if I haven't tracked it specifically, but if they do, my understanding is that they can barely, you know, to sail around their harbor, they may have engine trouble.
They have a famous propulsion system, right?
Yeah, famous in
sometimes it propulses.
Let's see, there was another question.
George had a very specific question about Kaliningrad.
Oh, right, yeah,
Let's not forget our first question.
Yeah, and exercise, and where, yeah, so I haven't really tracked that, you know, that's sort of the kind of question that, you know, and I can probably answer, you know, in terms of counting up exercises. You know, Kaliningrad is, you know, it's kind of, Kaliningrad is funny, right? It's a forward operating base, but it's also a vulnerability, and so it's, and I think until 2014, the Baltic Fleet was the sort of, you know, I mean, it was an area for testing new ships, and also an area, a fleet that, you know, did a lot of those exercises with NATO countries. So I think, you know, I mean, I haven't talked to any Russian Navy people in the Baltic Fleet, so I don't know what they actually think about any of this. But my guess would be that it is a kind of an adjustment for some people. For some, you know, as with, you know, a lot of defense planners in the U.S. I've talked to, for the older ones, you know, it's kind of easy to snap back to comfortable old patterns, right? Oh yeah, we remember when we were enemies. We know how to work that. So I think, you know, I think there's probably some of each there.
Yeah,
No.
okay.
I also have not tracked the exercises well enough to give you a head count, so.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about Kaliningrad. I mean, it seems like most of the fleet there is largely moribund, but they might be changing around what they deploy there.
they've put in the corvettes
Yeah.
there, right? And
Corvettes are
so,
there.
and as we've had earlier in the discussion, that's, those corvettes can be quite effective. I think there are three or four new corvettes there. I don't remember exactly. But.
Mm-hmm. And Commerce Bay is interesting because speaking earlier about access, I mean, remember, I think it was a couple months ago, there was a vocal complaint from the United States regarding strategic bombers refueling out of Commerce Bay and annoying people out in the Pacific, which I don't know why we decided to make that a prominent issue, but we did.
But it's striking, when we talk about Russian desire for access, they're talking about putting in for repairs, which is very different from what the United States means when it talks about access. I mean, really, nobody's thinking that these countries are going to give the Russians access to carry out military operations. Now, it's not impossible that they would, but you got to think about what those military operations might be.
And that's actually something worth mentioning for those who maybe aren't familiar. So, we talk, there was a couple years ago when Syria was more in the news than it is now. There was all this talk of the Russian naval base in Tartus, right?
Right.
So we have an image of what a naval base is, and that's not what it is, right? It's a repair facility with a couple of docks, and they had some guards there and
A watering hole.
I'm sorry.
It's a watering hole.
Yeah, and that's what it was, and that's all it could ever be. And it's not a place where they can, put a bunch of ships
Right.
and forward deploy, and
But
yeah.
we should not underestimate the power to annoy. And when you get access like that, the United States does not have a very good sense of humor about this. Even a couple Tu-95s they refuel the Comron Bay and then they flying over the Pacific, annoying the United States. That's it. Now we have to make it a public issue.
As long as they don't fall out of the sky.
Right. As long as they can come back and land, right? I mean, all right. Okay. We have a couple of minutes left, so let's do another round of questions. I have one gentleman with a very raised hand back there. It was very high up. I had to give it to you.
It's an exceedingly high read. Exceeds the grasp. Which might characterize a lot of the comments about the Russian Navy these days. But I'm wondering about the one area that you alluded to, Dmitry, in your presentation, which is the Arctic. And if there is an area in which the bear is more powerful than his neighbors, it might be that area. Are you so confident that this capacity for ice-going vessels is restricted to the Coast Guard or will be restricted to the Coast Guard? Isn't this a possible point of worry for U.S. Navy surface fleet planners as a point from which to project power? Does anyone talk about that? Or are we assuming that at least until the ice melt gets more calamitous than it is now, that it's not anything that we're going to worry about?
Okay. Who else is interested? Lady over there.
Wait for a microphone, please.
Oh.
Similar question. With respect to the Arctic, certainly significant to Russia in terms of its economic development plans, whether that will be shipping, probably not container ships, but more likely destinational shipping, having to some extent having to deal with oil and gas, and the need to protect what will 20, 30, 40 years hence be a far more open northern border, and 10 deep-water ports being constructed. There are 21 icebreakers on the Northern Sea Route at this time, some of them indeed aging. 5 of them nuclear-powered, about 5 or 6 more nuclear-powered projected. Some of the old Soviet bases being refurbished for search and rescue and oil spill response capabilities. And so is this viewed in the terms in which it's offered by Russia, or is this viewed in terms of a military, naval, Coast Guard action that would cause us to be threatened in some manner? Thank you.
Okay. All right. And I'm happy to take one more. Don't see it. Looks like we're good for now. Okay. All right.
Okay,
So
the
to
Arctic.
Arctic.
So I mean, sure, they could. I mean, the announced plans are that the ice-going vessels are going to be Coast Guard. Can they start building ice-going vessels for the Navy instead? Sure. Have they said they're going to? Not yet. But as far as power projection, they don't need to do that, right? I mean, the Murmansk is an ice-free port. That's why the Northern Fleet is there, and so you don't need ice-class ships to go and project power against the U.S. from Murmansk, which is already in the Arctic, right? So, I think that the ice part is not so much going somewhere else. It's about patrolling that coastline, and as long as they see the security situation there as fairly benign, the main goal is going to be, the kind of Coast Guard kinds of patrols. If it turned out that things got bad or worse than they are now, and they felt there was a potential threat, they could change that and start building up the military side. Instead, they'll have the infrastructure in terms of air bases and and even they're planning a brigade up in the Yamal Peninsula, so they've got the tools to do that. I don't think that right now they're more that's the idea is more defensive and patrolling rather than looking out, and I think that has something to do with the overall perception of security in the Arctic for Russia, which is still fairly benign. Even when, there's this funny dichotomy that they've had for years now. This predates the Ukraine crisis, where on the one hand, there was all this kind of rhetoric about Russian sovereignty in the Arctic, right? And the titanium flag on the ocean floor, and Rogozin doing whatever Rogozin does, wherever he happens to be doing it. And so lots of sort of blustery kind of statements. On the other hand, everyone that worked with the Russians in the Arctic Council and the 5 littoral states groups was always very, the reporting back was that they were very cooperative, that they wanted to resolve everything politically, through political discussion, through even the various, with the whole issue with the Lomonosov Ridge and the maritime claims. It was all, we'll just work through UNCLOS, the commission, we'll do it all the way it's supposed to be done. And when the commission the first round rejected their claims and sent them back to get more evidence, they said, fine, we'll go collect more evidence, right? So it was always the dispute, the maritime dispute, border dispute with Norway was by and large resolved. There was a lot of cooperation with Norway on kind of offshore oil and gas, which, a lot of that got suspended because the oil price dropped and they were no longer profitable, but nonetheless, there was a lot of cooperation there. So, and I don't think, I haven't seen any signs that that's changed dramatically, right? I mean, there's maybe more bellicose rhetoric because of the overall relationship. There's maybe harder to cooperate because the overall relationship is, there's various channels that have been frozen, but the Arctic is not it's very much a kind of a tertiary area for confrontation as opposed to, say, the Black Sea or the Baltic. So I think that's kind of where we are with the Arctic.
I'll take the discussant's prerogative here to say the same thing with different words. No, because I agree. I think what's important to remember about the Arctic is that Russia is really excited about global climate change, right? The visions of tankers dance in their heads. The ice is melting. Oh my God, think of how quickly we can move stuff. And that's mostly what's been driving it. But you do have this posturing and this bellicose rhetoric. And I'll say what worries me most about the Arctic is us rising to the bait. Because they behave fine. They talk a nasty talk, but their behavior is just fine. We get nervous about the talk, and we start behaving. Our behavior in the Arctic has not always been fine, right? No, law of the sea, all that. We start behaving in ways that are, that are counter-posturing, And then they see that as a threat because they see everything we do as a threat. And that's where you do run into a place that could be dangerous. If everyone rather insistently cooperates, that gets averted.
Can I just
Yeah,
add a couple of things? One thing that I found fascinating with looking at the Arctic is the sort of the strange alliances and sort of confrontation zones that get formed, right? So if we talk about freedom of navigation, the alliance there, as far as the Arctic is concerned, is Canada and Russia versus everyone else. Right, because they're the ones with the passages that they want to control, and everyone else wants to sail through them without any impediment, right? And so you've got the U.S. and China essentially versus Canada and Russia. You don't think of that as a normal set of alliances, right? Then you've got the 5 littoral states against the interlopers. So there, Russia and the U.S. are on the same page versus, say, China and some EU countries, perhaps, right? Because they want to have unfettered access in a different way, and then the littoral states say, well, this is our territory here, right? And so you get, and then I could go on, but there's these kinds of things that get really interesting really quickly, and you're sort of like, oh well. Never think of the U.S. and Canada being on opposite sides of issues, but they are. And the other thing I just wanted to add on the climate change, I agree on the visions of trans, but on the other hand, this is not a naval issue. So climate change might well be a disaster for Russia in terms of the permafrost.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah, so they might be able to sail the ships through, but their cities, their Arctic cities are going to sink.
Yes. But that's okay.
Well, if the pipelines that supply the stuff to the ships are breaking because
Then you
they're,
have a problem.
then you have a problem.
All right. Okay, there's no other questions, I think we're going to wrap it up. But it's a very, very fascinating discussion, again, brilliant for Friday morning as well in the state. I think we learned quite a bit of Russian naval capabilities, and also teased out a lot of differences, okay? What are capabilities versus platform? What's power projection versus annoyance? So I want to thank again Dmitry Gorenburg and Oliker. Hopefully this is the first kind of installment in what will be a joint series that we'll be doing over the coming next several months. Next one likely is obviously not going to be on maybe naval capabilities, but will be on something else within the sphere of Russian military capabilities. So I hope you'll join us again. And I want to thank everybody for coming.